The message arrived at 10:47 that morning, from an account with no profile picture and a username that was simply a string of numbers, and it contained exactly one sentence and a single attachment: "You deserve to know where he actually is right now." I almost deleted it without opening the attachment at all, understanding, in that first instinctive half-second, that this was very likely some kind of scam, the specific, ordinary caution you develop after years of ignoring messages from strangers claiming urgent, alarming things about your own life. I opened it anyway. My name is Yolanda Prescott, I'm 39 years old, and this is the story of the single screenshot that arrived on an entirely ordinary Tuesday morning, showing a location pin, timestamped to that exact moment, placing my husband, Desmond, not at the 10 o'clock board meeting he'd left the house for 2 hours earlier, but at a luxury hotel 11 miles across town, and the exact, deliberate process I moved through over the following 6 weeks to understand exactly what that pin actually meant. I need to explain how I even had any reasonable way to verify that message, because the specific mechanism mattered enormously to what happened next. Desmond and I had, roughly 3 years earlier, set up shared location tracking through our phone's family safety features, a decision we'd made together after a genuinely frightening evening when my own car had broken down on a remote stretch of highway and neither of us had been able to quickly locate the other. It was meant, at the time, as a simple safety measure, the kind of thing reasonable, trusting couples do without much fanfare, and I hadn't checked Desmond's location in months, understanding it as a background safety net rather than anything I actively monitored. I opened that tracking app for the first time in what felt like a considerable while, sitting at our kitchen table with my coffee going cold, and I want to describe the specific, physical sensation of watching that blue dot load on the screen, pulsing gently at an address I didn't recognize, considerably far from Desmond's downtown office. I sat with that screen open for a long moment, feeling something cold and careful settle into my chest, understanding that whatever this actually was, an innocent explanation or something considerably worse, I needed to approach it with more discipline than my racing heart currently wanted to allow. I want to explain the specific decision I made in that first hour, because it shaped everything that followed. I did not text Desmond immediately, demanding an explanation. I did not drive directly to that address, prepared for some dramatic, immediate confrontation. I understood, sitting at that kitchen table with my coffee finally, completely cold, that I needed to move carefully, methodically, and that whatever explanation Desmond eventually offered, confronted suddenly and without preparation, would very likely be shaped by panic rather than complete honesty. Exactly the pattern I'd have no way of distinguishing from the truth if I gave him any opportunity to construct it in real time. I called my closest friend, Bettina, a woman I'd known since college, someone whose judgment I trusted completely, and read her the anonymous message word for word. She was quiet for a long moment before she said something that reframed how I approached everything over the following weeks. "Before you do anything else," she said, "you need to understand whether that location app can be spoofed or faked somehow, because if it can't, you're not dealing with a suspicion anymore. You're dealing with a fact. And facts require a different kind of response than suspicion does." I want to describe the specific, careful research I did that same afternoon, because it mattered considerably to understanding exactly what I was actually looking at. I contacted the company that made our phone's operating system directly, working through their support chat under the guise of a general security question, and confirmed, after a fairly lengthy exchange, that the specific location sharing feature Desmond and I used relied on GPS data pulled directly from the device itself, a system that, while not entirely immune to sophisticated spoofing under very specific circumstances, wasn't something a stranger could remotely fake without physical access to Desmond's actual phone. In other words, whatever I was looking at, that blue dot pulsing at an unfamiliar hotel address, almost certainly represented my husband's actual, physical location in real time. I sat with that confirmation for a considerable while, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost clinical given how much my hands were actually shaking, that I needed to verify this in person before I did anything further, rather than relying entirely on a screen. I drove to that hotel address myself, arriving roughly 90 minutes after the original message, and I want to describe the specific, surreal experience of pulling into that parking lot and immediately recognizing Desmond's car, parked in a visitor space near the hotel's side entrance, exactly where the location pin had indicated. I sat in my own car for a long time, staring at his familiar vehicle, feeling something considerably more complicated than simple confirmation, a specific, disorienting vertigo, understanding that whatever story I'd believed about my own Tuesday morning had just been proven, undeniably, to be false. I want to explain why I didn't go inside that hotel immediately, demanding to know what room he was in, because the decision required a discipline I genuinely wasn't certain I possessed sitting in that parking lot. I understood, with a clarity that surprised even me given the raw shock of the moment, that walking into that lobby and creating an immediate scene would give Desmond every opportunity to construct whatever explanation felt most survivable in the moment, without my ever understanding the actual, complete shape of whatever this was. I photographed his car, the parking space number, the timestamp on my own phone, and I drove home, understanding I needed to think considerably more carefully about my next move than my racing pulse currently wanted to allow. I want to describe the specific, complicated few days that followed, because I think it matters to give an honest account of exactly how disorienting that period genuinely was. Desmond came home that same Tuesday evening at his usual time, describing his day in the exact ordinary detail he always did, mentioning a client lunch, a difficult conversation with a vendor, nothing whatsoever about a hotel 11 miles from his office. I watched him describe an entirely fictional afternoon with total, practiced ease, and I understood, watching him, exactly how thoroughly he must have rehearsed this kind of casual, convincing deception, given how effortlessly it came out of him. I called Bettina again that evening, once Desmond had gone to bed, and I remember her asking me a specific question that shaped everything I did over the following weeks. "Do you want to understand what this actually is before you confront him?" she asked, "or do you want to confront him and hope he tells you the truth?" I understood immediately, hearing that question, exactly which path made more sense given everything I already knew about how convincingly Desmond had just described a day I now knew, with certainty, hadn't actually happened the way he described it. I want to explain the specific, methodical process I moved through over the following 2 weeks, because I understood, sitting with Bettina's question, that I needed considerably more than a single confirmed location before I could fully understand whatever this actually was. I began checking that tracking app daily, without Desmond's knowledge, understanding, with a specific discomfort, that I was doing something I'd never previously imagined myself doing, but that felt, given everything I now knew, entirely necessary rather than paranoid. Over those 2 weeks, I documented a pattern that emerged with a consistency I hadn't anticipated. Every Tuesday and Thursday, between roughly 10 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, Desmond's location placed him not at his office, but at that same hotel, always the same building, though I couldn't yet determine which specific room. I want to explain who eventually sent me that original message, because understanding her identity mattered enormously to everything that followed. I responded to that anonymous account roughly a week after the initial message, asking, carefully, who she was and why she'd reached out to me specifically. The response, when it finally came, took nearly 3 days to arrive, and it explained something I hadn't anticipated at all. The woman, who eventually identified herself as Priscilla Vance, told me she worked at the hotel's front desk, and had recognized Desmond over several months as a recurring guest who checked into the same room, always under a name that wasn't his own, always paying in cash specifically to avoid any card trail, always meeting the same woman, someone Priscilla had seen him with enough times to recognize immediately. "I found your name and number through his own wallet," she wrote, which he left in his car with the window cracked one afternoon while I was on a smoke break outside. I know this is strange and probably crosses a line I shouldn't have crossed. But I have a sister who went through something similar, and by the time she found out, she'd lost years she can never get back. I didn't want that for you if I could help it. I sat with that message for a long time, understanding, with a complicated mixture of gratitude and unease, that a stranger's own private grief about her sister's experience had apparently become the mechanism that finally, accidentally exposed whatever Desmond had been building. I want to describe the specific decision I made once I had Priscilla's account, because it shaped the entire remainder of this story. I retained an attorney, a careful, direct woman named Odessa Kimura who specialized in complex divorce cases, roughly 10 days after that first anonymous message, understanding that I needed professional guidance before I confronted Desmond with anything at all. Odessa listened to my entire account without interrupting, and when I finished, she recommended I hire a private investigator to establish, definitively and with proper documentation, exactly what I was actually dealing with, understanding that whatever I eventually pursued, whether divorce proceedings or simply my own clarity, would benefit considerably from evidence gathered independently and professionally rather than through my own increasingly anxious, amateur surveillance. The investigator, a methodical woman named Bernadine Kessler, confirmed, over the following 2 weeks, considerably more than I had initially braced myself for. Desmond had been renting that same hotel room, under a fabricated name, twice weekly for just over 8 months, always meeting the same woman, a real estate agent named Carmela Duchamp, 36 years old, someone Bernadine's investigation eventually traced back to a professional connection through a commercial property Desmond's company had leased 2 years earlier. I want to explain the specific detail that reorganized my understanding of this entire situation, because it revealed a considerably more calculated pattern than a simple, ongoing affair alone. Bernadine's financial tracing, conducted alongside a forensic accountant. Odessa brought in once the scope became clear, discovered that Desmond had been paying for that hotel room, along with a series of gifts and dinners documented through Carmela's own social media, using a business expense account connected to his consulting work, funds that had never once appeared on our own joint financial statements, meaning our household had, for the better part of a year, been operating on considerably less than Desmond actually earned, while the difference funded an entirely separate relationship I had no knowledge of. I want to describe what Bernadine discovered about the specific arrangement itself, because it added a layer of premeditation I hadn't fully anticipated. Desmond had apparently selected that particular hotel specifically because it operated under a corporate account his company held for legitimate business travel, one he'd apparently learned, through his own role managing certain vendor relationships, could be used to book rooms without generating the kind of personal credit card record I might eventually discover through our own shared accounts. It was, understanding it laid out plainly in Bernadine's report, a genuinely calculated system, one he'd apparently refined and maintained with a consistency that suggested he'd given considerable thought to exactly how to avoid detection. I confronted Desmond roughly 5 weeks after that first anonymous message, having spent that entire period carefully assembling documentation with Odessa's guidance, understanding I needed the complete picture before giving him any opportunity to construct a careful, managed explanation. I arranged the conversation to happen at Odessa's office rather than at our own home, understanding the specific value of removing any home field advantage from a man who had spent 8 months managing an elaborate, deliberately untraceable second relationship with genuine sophistication. I watched Desmond's face when Odessa laid Bernadine's full report on the table between us, the hotel records, the financial tracing, photographs of him and Carmela together outside that same hotel entrance on multiple documented occasions. I watched something in his posture collapse entirely, watched him understand, in real time, exactly how thoroughly this had been documented, exactly how little room remained for any kind of careful, managed explanation. "How did you even find out about this?" he asked, his voice considerably smaller than the one I'd known across 15 years of marriage. I want to describe the specific detail of that question, because it told me something important in itself. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Let me explain." Simply an immediate, reflexive concern about the mechanics of discovery, the exact same instinct I'd come to understand, reading about betrayal in the weeks since, as considerably more common than genuine remorse in these initial moments of exposure. "That's not the question that matters right now," I told him, keeping my own voice as level as I could manage given the magnitude of what we were actually discussing. "The question that matters is why, for 8 months, you built an entire deliberate system specifically designed to make sure I never found out, using company funds, a fake name, cash payments, every single detail engineered around the specific goal of my own continued ignorance." He didn't have a genuine answer for that. Over the following hour, he admitted, in halting, uneven pieces, that his relationship with Carmela had begun during that commercial lease negotiation nearly a year earlier, and had escalated, gradually, into something he described, with a specific vagueness I found almost as insulting as the deception itself, as something I didn't plan for but couldn't seem to stop. I asked him, directly, whether he had ever genuinely intended to tell me, at any point, or whether he had simply intended to continue managing both relationships indefinitely, for as long as he could sustain the necessary logistics. He was quiet for a long moment before admitting, with what I recognized as genuine discomfort rather than performed remorse, that he honestly didn't know the answer to that question himself, that he'd never actually allowed himself to think that far ahead, choosing instead to focus only on whatever the next immediate arrangement required. I want to explain what happened over the following months, because the consequences extended considerably beyond our own divorce proceedings. Odessa filed for divorce on my behalf, citing the specific pattern of financial misconduct alongside the infidelity itself, understanding that the diverted business expenses gave me considerably more legal leverage than a standard divorce proceeding typically would have provided. The forensic accountant's full report, once complete, revealed that Desmond had diverted just over $90,000 over 8 months, funds that had gone toward hotel rooms, gifts, dinners, and a considerable portion of a vacation Carmela had taken, alone, that Desmond had told me, at the time, was a mandatory work conference he couldn't avoid. I want to describe what Desmond's own employer eventually discovered, because it added a professional consequence neither of us had initially anticipated. Once Odessa's discovery process required certain financial records be produced, Desmond's company's own internal compliance team identified the same pattern of misused corporate hotel accounts, understanding, once they reviewed the documentation, that he had been using company resources for personal purposes in a manner that violated his own employment agreement. He was terminated roughly 3 months after our initial confrontation, a consequence that, combined with the divorce settlement itself, considerably reduced his financial position going forward. I want to explain what eventually happened with Carmela, because I think it matters to give a complete account of this situation. I never confronted her directly, understanding, once I'd processed my own anger sufficiently, that whatever role she'd played, she too had apparently believed some version of events Desmond had constructed to manage the relationship's specific parameters. I learned, secondhand, roughly 8 months later, that her own relationship with Desmond hadn't survived the transition from secret to public, once the affair became known within their shared professional circles, and the financial fallout made the entire arrangement considerably less appealing than whatever fantasy either of them had originally constructed around it. I want to describe what I eventually learned about Priscilla, the stranger whose anonymous message had started this entire process, because her own story added an unexpected depth to everything that followed. I reached out to her once the divorce proceedings were largely resolved, wanting to thank her properly for what her courage that day had ultimately allowed me to understand months, possibly years, sooner than I might have otherwise. She told me, during a brief phone call, that her own sister had spent nearly 4 years in a similarly deceptive marriage before finally discovering the truth, years that had cost her sister considerably more, financially and emotionally, than the relatively faster resolution I'd been able to pursue once I had the actual facts in front of me. I couldn't watch it happen again without saying something, she told me, even if it wasn't really my business to say anything at all. I retained full ownership of our shared home as part of the divorce settlement, along with compensation reflecting the diverted funds Bernadine's investigation had documented, and I moved through the following year rebuilding a life that felt, for the first time in longer than I fully understood, entirely, uncomplicatedly my own. I disabled that location sharing app entirely once the divorce finalized, understanding that whatever safety net it had once represented had, in the end, become the exact mechanism that revealed everything I'd needed to know, not through any malfunction, but through the simple, unglamorous fact of a stranger's own conscience refusing to stay quiet. I think often, still, about that Tuesday morning, about the specific, careful decision to open an attachment I nearly deleted without a second thought, about how close I came to never fully understanding what my own marriage had actually become over the preceding 8 months. I think about Priscilla, a woman I'd never met, watching a pattern repeat itself closely enough to her own sister's story that she felt compelled to risk an uncomfortable, uninvited intervention into a stranger's life. I understand, with real clarity now, considerable distance from that initial discovery, that whatever justice I eventually secured existed specifically because I trusted a message I had every reasonable instinct to dismiss, and because I chose patience and documentation over an immediate, explosive confrontation that would have given Desmond every opportunity to manage the truth before I ever fully understood it myself. If you've made it this far with me tonight, I want to ask you something honestly, something I've turned over often in the months since that Tuesday morning changed everything I understood about my own marriage. If a stranger sent you a message like that, with no explanation beyond a single location pin, would you have opened it immediately, or would you have done what I nearly did, almost deleting it as an obvious scam, before something made you look closer? Tell me exactly where you're watching from tonight, and if this story reached something real in you, subscribe, because there are more stories like mine waiting here every week.